Hi, this is Tony Isabella, creator of Black Lightning, and you're listening to Mr. Media.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,000 of my previous celebrity interviews at MrMedia.com. That's MRmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, Alexa Podcasts, or Stitcher, and follow me on Twitter and Facebook. And if you like the show, please tell the world with a 5-star review on iTunes or Apple Podcasts. On today's show, I'll talk to Tony Isabella, longtime comic book writer and editor who's also the creator of Black Lightning, the character the CW adapted to TV to thunderous acclaim this winter. Stick around. If you've been enjoying the CW's latest superhero adventure series, Black Lightning, you can thank a middle-aged white guy in Cleveland for the character's creation. Comic book writer Tony Isabella unleashed Black Lightning on DC Comics readers in 1977. Marvel had its hero for hire, Luke Cage, and Isabella responded by giving the world the electrifying superhero whose alter ego is Jefferson Pierce. The character carried his own book for a time, eventually forming the Outsiders and becoming a member of the Justice League of America. Isabella, who also created Black Goliath for Marvel and wrote episodes of Luke Cage Power Man, is a comics veteran who was essentially blackballed out of the industry for many years when he demanded credit and compensation from DC for creating Black Lightning. Until the CW committed to adding an African-American hero to its burgeoning roster of DC-based TV series, Isabella's demands were ignored. On March 27, 2017, a year to the day we recorded this interview, Warner Brothers, parent company of DC, finally decided to recognize Isabella as creator of Black Lightning with production royalties and on-screen credit. And DC Comics invited him back to write a new Black Lightning 6-part limited series, Cold Dead Hands, as part of the TV launch. If you haven't seen it, Black Lightning, the TV series, is remarkably well done. It features a primarily African-American cast with deep backstories, sharp writing, and emotional character arcs. And it looks great, too. This is Isabella's second visit to Mr. Media. He first joined us in 2010 to talk about his book, 1,000 Comic Books You Must Read. Tony Isabella, welcome back to Mr. Media.
Nice to be back.
Nice to have you, and congratulations on the huge splash that Black Lightning has made on the CW. How did it feel to see your creation come to life in your own living room?
Well, I have to say this was a kind of a complicated process.
And
one thing I want to state up front is that, my difficulties with DC Comics all were with the previous management of DC Comics. The current management of DC Comics and Entertainment reached out to me through Jeff Johns a few years back to kind of feel me out about reconciling, get my side of the story, and see if we could put together an agreement that would satisfy both parties. It took a while for the lawyers to work out this agreement, but they did, and they actually, even before we had a signed agreement, it was pretty clear that DC and I wanted to work together again. And indeed, the very first thing DC asked me to write, Jeff Johns asked me to write, was a paper on the core values of Black Lightning. And that paper was the starting point of the TV series. Now, while I have no official role with the TV series, I have been in the loop from the start. When they hired the wonderful Salim and Mara Brock Akil to be the showrunners, we had a conference call that went on and on and on, where they asked me tons of questions about the characters and told me some of what they planned. Last July, before the show started filming, I was brought to Burbank, California, to meet with the Black Lightning writers. And again, it was the same sort of thing where I'm answering their questions. They're asking me questions about comic books I wrote 40 years ago. And that's where this whole thing really hit me. The enormity of this really hit me. I've always known Black Lightning was a terrific character, destined for great things. You can't go to conventions and have people come up to you with tears in their eyes because Black Lightning was the first time they saw themselves in a comic book, and not know that there's something very special about Black Lightning and Jefferson Pierce that largely transcends me and anybody else who's worked on these characters. So I walk into the writer's room, and on one side of the room is a whiteboard with the first season's 13 episodes very roughly roughed out. And just looking at that, I see a lot of myself on that board. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the room, there's this board with pictures of characters, names of characters, and half of them are characters I created. So at that point, I'm already getting like pretty lightheaded and just excited as heck, because not only is Black Lightning coming to TV, but there's an awful lot of me in Black Lightning. And, of course, a lot of the things that the Akeels and the actors and the writers have brought to the character. So at that point on, I was in contact with the writers. I was in contact with the Akeels. I was in contact with several of the actors. This is all on a very unofficial basis. I like to think of myself as the head cheerleader for the show. Mm-hmm. When I finally saw the show, it was a screener that didn't have all the special effects and didn't have any of the credits in. And I watched it with my family, and we were just blown away by how good it was. And then when we saw it, and then DC flew me out for the premiere of the show at their DC and DC event in Washington, D.C. on Martin Luther King weekend, and I got to see the first episode on a big screen with my name right up there in the opening credits, and got to meet the entire cast, who were just, I already knew from talking to them via social media they were great people, and meeting them just reinforced them. What a great bunch of actors, so dedicated to telling these very important stories. So after the premiere, we had a party at my house the day it actually aired on the CW, and watching Black Lightning has been our weekly Tuesday night thing ever since. We do pause the TV when my credit line appears so that we can have a quick round of applause. But then after that, we keep watching and watch it all the way through, because it is just a magnificent program, an important program, and I'm biased, but it's, to me, the best program on TV.
I had Chris Claremont on with me a couple weeks ago, and we talked a little about you. And one of the things that he said about his experience with the X-Men adaptation in the films is that his favorite moment, I think, so far has been sitting in the theater and Hugh Jackman says this line of his, I'm the best there is at what I do, or I'm probably getting it wrong, but it's close to that. And he stood up and he said, "That's my line." So I'm wondering, well, have you had any experience, any moment like that so far?
Oh yeah, I didn't stand up and and shout or anything, but the very first scene in the Black Lightning TV show, when the voiceover has "Justice like lightning should ever appear, to some men hope and to other men fear," and that is my version of an ancient poem. Now, the original version of the poem was by a guy named Thomas Randolph, and it didn't have the word hope in that, and it didn't distinguish between some men hope, some men fear. So I kind of rewrote the line for the very first issue of Black Lightning, and hear that line recited at the very beginning of the first episode, just, it brought tears to my eyes. I was thrilled beyond belief.
I thought you were going to say it had some connection back to the Shadow. It sounds a little like what the Shadow says at the beginning of every episode, every radio episode. But no real connection with the Shadow. It was just Roy Thomas had used the original poem in an issue of Captain Marvel over at Marvel. I liked it, but I thought it could be improved upon, because I was a cocky young man, and so when I stole it for Black Lightning, I rewrote it to more fit what I wanted it to say for my character. Got it. Well, I have to ask you, because the Hollywood Reporter actually had a story on this week, debating whether or not Black Lightning on TV is part of the so-called Arrowverse with Arrow and Flash and Legends. Do you have an opinion on that? I have to ask.
Well, my opinion, as opposed to what I know, my opinion is that Black Lightning doesn't need to be part of the Arrowverse, that Black Lightning can stand on its own. If anything, we should be starting a Black Lightning verse. But then when it comes to the comics, I'm also the guy who says that I never again want to see Black Lightning subservient to a Batman or a Superman. I never want Black Lightning to be the guy that says how high when Batman tells him to jump. So my opinion is that Black Lightning doesn't need the rest of the Arrowverse. Officially, we have not, they have not said one way or the other whether it's connected to the Arrowverse. They have said that they don't want to have an explicit connection to the Arrowverse in the first season. And again, Salim Akil has said he'd like to create a Black Lightning verse. So, my feeling is that at this point, you cannot definitively say it's connected. When fans say it is, that's just, the fans who want to see every hero in every story and want everything connected. And, maybe when I was 12, I would have felt that way, but I don't feel that way now. I think a lot of these characters and stories can stand on their own. They don't need, a dozen tie-ins to other shows and characters.
Tony, I hadn't thought about this until just now. Otherwise, I would have looked this up, so I apologize for not knowing the answer to this. But obviously, you created Black Lightning. Before that, you worked on Luke Cage, Power Man, at Marvel. You created another Marvel character, Black Goliath. Did you ever work on Black Panther in any way?
No, I didn't. Black Panther was Don McGregor's baby when I was up at the Marvel offices, and Don McGregor happens to be my favorite Black Lightning writer. So I would look over stuff. I mean, because we would all share stuff in the office, and we'd all talk about the work we were doing. So I could watch Black Panther taking form as Don and Rich Buckler and Billy Graham and others worked on it. But no, I never actually worked on the Black Panther. I'm not sure I even wrote him as a guest star anywhere. Over at Marvel, I wrote some issues of Luke Cage. I wrote the Falcon in Captain America. I created Misty Knight when I was writing Iron Fist, although Chris Claremont did the heavy lifting on Misty Knight. And I wrote the Living Mummy, who not everybody realizes was black since he was all wrapped up in bandages.
I did not know that. I love that. I actually love that book, but I did not realize he was black. So what is a white guy from Cleveland doing with this developed expertise over the years of creating and succeeding with so many of these black characters? What's that all about?
Cue the origin story. I grew up in Cleveland, which was a very segregated city and still is in many ways. My very first black friends were comic book fans who I met because they would come from the east side of Cleveland to the west side of Cleveland to attend meetings of a comic book club I had formed that met at the Cadell Recreation Center. Diversity wasn't really a part of my language then, but I thought it was unfair that my black friends didn't have more black heroes. And so I always told myself that if I got in the comics, I would try to address that inequality, which is why I kind of gravitated towards black characters at Marvel and then created Black Lightning over at DC. The tragic part of that origin story is the Cadell Recreation Center is where a few years back, 12-year-old Tamir Rice was gunned down by a couple of Cleveland police officers that, had the Cleveland Police Department done its due diligence on these officers, would have never been out there on the street to begin with, would have not been cops. And so a 12-year-old boy was murdered, killed, right in front of this place that had previously held nothing but happy memories for me. And that killing is one of the starting points for my Black Lightning Cold Dead Hands series.
Wow, it's nice how you tied all that together so neatly.
I learned from Stan Lee.
That was really good. I was like, wow, where's he? Oh, wow, look where he went with that. Okay, so let's continue with the origin story. How did this kid from Cleveland get into comics? Tell me about that.
Well, I learned to read from comics and learned to write from comics when I was 4 years old. Adults would read comic books to me, and I wanted to cut out the middleman. So I paid very close attention to the words as much as the pictures as they read to me, and I basically taught myself to read. I always liked comics as a way to tell stories, especially when the Marvel Age came around and Stan Lee and Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko were creating these great comic books. It wasn't until I went on a vacation trip with my family, one of those boring vacation trips where there's maybe like one thing you're kind of interested in, but the rest of it is things your parents think you should be interested in. Mm-hmm. And at every stop along the way, this was 1963 July, I would buy a comic book because you could buy comic books at every stop along the way in 1963. Well, my parents got very upset with me spending my souvenir money on comic books. I felt it's my souvenir money. So when we got to Oneonta, New York, where we had family, we go to my great-uncle's combination cigar shop and magazine store, and I make a beeline for the comic books, and my mother grabs me and says, I'm only allowed to buy one more comic book this trip. So I was going to show them I was going to buy a quarter comic. The only quarter comic I didn't have was Fantastic Four Annual Number 1. This is how stubborn I was as a kid. I didn't even like the Fantastic Four. I had read one issue, Kurgo, Master of Planet X, and didn't like it. But since it was the only quarter book I hadn't read, I bought it. Turns out Fantastic Four Annual Number 1 is the greatest comic book ever created. It's got a 37-page lead story with Submariner conquering the New York. It's got the origin recap. It's got a recap of when they met Spider-Man. It has all these pages of facts on their villains and themselves. And so while reading that comic, which I read a dozen times on that trip, it occurred to me that making comic books was a job, and it was a job I wanted. I didn't really think I'd be able to get that job. You had to go to New York, and the industry wasn't that big. So my backup plan was to be Clark Kent. I went to the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a tool of the rich and powerful, and realized that I wasn't really going to be Clark Kent either. So when the paper went out on strike, I called Roy Thomas over at Marvel. He had just been named editor-in-chief, and asked if there were any entry-level positions at Marvel, and there was one. They needed somebody to work with Stan Lee on a new line of British Comics weeklies that would be produced in New York, but sent to England and printed over there and distributed over there. So that was my first job, basically assisting Stan Lee, designing covers, writing cover copy, writing new splash pages where necessary, because we would break up the stories into 2 or 3 parts, writing letter columns, just doing all the little editorial chores that you have to do. And once you're on staff at Marvel, because the staff pay was not that great, this was 1972, they would give you lots of opportunities to do freelance writing. And so I started out writing articles for the black and white magazines we were publishing, like Dracula Lives and Monsters Unleashed and Deadly Hands of Kung Fu. And then I got some chances to write comic books for those magazines and others, and eventually ended up as a full-time writer.
And how old were you when you got to New York?
I was, 20 years old.
Had you been to the city before, just out of curiosity?
I had been to the city a couple of times to go to the old New York comic conventions that were run by Phil Suling. So I had some knowledge of New York, but really, if the Marvel offices had been in the middle of nowhere, I would have still gone there for the chance to work at Marvel Comics and to work with people like Stan Lee and Roy Thomas and Sal Brodsky, who was my immediate superior.
And that was a time, from what I understand, where it was not unusual to have very young people working in the office. I mean, Shooter got his job there very young. Chris Claremont, who I mentioned before, started very young, right?
Yeah, so did Jim Salicrup, who ended up as a Marvel editor and then an editor at Topps Comics and now runs Paper Cuts, which is a comics division of NBM. There was this whole generation that didn't come into the industry because comics were, considered a disgraceful thing. So you had all these guys in the 50s who, were either had just gotten into business or were holdover from the 40s. And then you didn't really get some new people into the industry until the late 60s, when the stigma of working in comics had dissipated, plus comics fandom had started. So around the late 60s, early 70s, you started getting an influx of younger talent in. And I was part of a wave of people that included lots of people from Detroit and the Midwest and basically all over the country.
Can you paint us a further picture of what it was like to work in the Marvel offices in 72, 73, 74, in terms of who was coming in every day? And we'll say that we understand that, of the quote-unquote bullpen, a lot of people were freelancers, but there were people that were in every day. What did the office look like? Was it tell us about it.
I have to go back through my mind a little bit here, but when I started working at Marvel, and I couldn't tell you the address if my life depended on it because we moved a couple of times, there were several offices, none of them particularly large. I worked in one of the larger offices, sharing it with Sal Brodsky. Pablo Marcus usually worked in our office because he was doing a lot of production work and artwork for other things. Rich Buckler would sometimes work in there. George Roussos, who was coloring most of the Marvel covers, was in there, but George would always have file cabinets all around him to kind of create his own little George cave, which was great fun for me because George was a terrific guy, full of great stories, and every now and then a voice from nowhere would come and say, "Tony, get in here, I want to show you something." So I'd get up from my desk and go into George's little man cave there, and he'd show me something he was working on or share some bit of comic wisdom that he thought I should know. And it was a great experience. There was also, John Forporton, who was the production manager, he had his own office. Roy Thomas and Stan Lee had their own offices. There was some business guy that had an office near ours. There was a very tiny room where Marv Wolfman and Don McGregor would proofread comics. Behind them was the stat room where Stu Schwartzberg would be making photostats, because back then we didn't do the coloring on computers. He'd make photostats of the pages, and then the artist would color them with their markers and dyes, and then mark them up with the values for the color separators. There was a larger bullpen area, and I'm trying to remember, at various times you'd see, Dave Hunt was there, Mike Esposito, Frank Giacoia, Maury Kuramoto, Danny Crespi, a few other guys were there all the time. But artists would come in from time to time, and, if there was a free desk, they'd use it if they had to make corrections and things like that. We then moved and we had bigger offices, but they were still pretty small. I think when we moved to the bigger offices, we actually had an area that we kind of called a freelancers area, where there'd be desks, there'd be tabourets and art boards for artists to work on. But it was, they were small offices. I have not been to the Marvel offices in decades, so I don't know what they look like now. I have gone to the DC offices in Burbank, and they're palatial. I mean, I would move into those offices if I could. They have all sorts of great artwork on the wall. They have memorabilia like costumes from some of the movies. They have a chessboard in their waiting room with all the chess figures being, heroes and villains. They have, displays of comic books all over the place. They have a huge editorial area. I mean, it's just huge and beautiful and bright. And opposed to every other time I'd ever been to DC offices, everybody seemed really happy to be there. There wasn't the kind of gloomy, deer in the headlights, people looking through the bars waiting to escape kind of atmosphere that had existed with the previous management of DC. The current DC offices are just gorgeous.
I was just thinking as you were describing that, I'm remembering going to the Marvel. I actually got to go to the Marvel offices once in the mid-'70s and the DC offices once. I can't remember. I think when I went to the Marvel office, I want to say that our mutual acquaintance friend Bob Pinaha was with me, and a couple other guys from a comic book club, and we got a bit of a tour, and we met a very young George Perez, and that just seemed like such a fun office. Of course, I'm 15, 16, and it, you want it to be what you want it to be. It's comic books and it's Marvel. But I seem to recall that was a very fun place. And then probably within that same year, I went to D.C. To do an interview with Paul Levitz, and that just seemed a lot more sterile. It was cold. It just didn't scream fun and games like Marvel did. I don't know. It's just my recollection.
You pretty much nailed the difference between those two places in the 70s. I will say that one of my big regrets from my time at Marvel is that because I was so young and because I was an editor actually hiring people and giving assignments to artists and writers, I didn't want to be perceived as a comics fan. And as a result, I blew the opportunity to have interviewed all of these classic creators who are no longer with us. I worked with Dick Ayers and Don Heck. Bill Everett was still alive at that point, coming into the offices. I worked with George Tuska, John Buscema, Sal Buscema, John Romita. So many great artists, most of whom are not with us anymore. And it was an opportunity to have really documented their history. And some guys, thank God for guys like David Anthony Kraft, who did a little bit of that in his magazine Comics interview. But that was one of my big regrets, that because I felt I had to be very professional in the offices, because I had come up from comics fandom and because I was so much younger than virtually everyone working for me, that I couldn't let my fan flag unfurl while I was in the offices.
Well, and I want to take a second and amend what I was just saying about being in the Marvel offices. I want to point out who else was with me, because God forbid that they should hear this and think I forgot them. Alan Zarnecki, Chris Padovano, and a guy named Bernie Hoje, who was the best artist that I knew as a teenager, who went on to create the Get Milk campaign. Isn't that amazing? I only found that out a few years ago, and Bernie's a remarkably talented guy. Anyway, around that same period, I was in a Ford Pinto, a little brown Ford Pinto that went to Newark International Airport and picked up a guy named Tony Isabella. Bob Pinaha was behind the wheel. And I am damned if I can remember why we drove to the airport to pick you up. And I don't know that you'll remember, but I remember sitting behind you and Bob. I'm sitting in the back of that cramped little car, and you guys are talking about comics. And I don't know about Bob, but I was just so fascinated to hear this real talk.
What year was this?
I want to say it was 76, maybe 77, could be 75, I guess. But
boy, I have no memory of when that would be, because I I moved to New York in late '72. I think Halloween was my first day at Marvel. I lived in New York pretty much nonstop until '75. Moved back to Cleveland for a few months, then moved back to New York for about a year before moving back to Ohio permanently. So I suppose that could have been a trip that I made when I was not living in New York. I could have been coming back from visiting my family, but I have no real memory of that. I've been in this business now for over 45 years, and a lot of these details they're just not there. Had I known people were going to be asking me about them 45 years later, I would have taken notes.
Oh, I completely understand. I'm going to have to ask Pinaha what that was about. I thought, up until late last night, I thought that we had gone to pick you up because the comic book, boy, I'm admitting to a lot here, folks. The comic book club that we were involved in started, the Fans of Central Jersey, sponsored a couple of comic book shows. And until late last night, I thought that maybe you had come in for that. But then I thought, well, we didn't have a budget to fly you in. And then I looked through the materials and I couldn't find you listed as a guest. So then I thought, well, why did we go to the airport to get Tony? But I'll ask Pinaha. Maybe he'll remember.
Boy, I hope he does, because I have no memory of this.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's so clear to me. All right, so while we're still on the Marvel issue, tell me about being in close proximity to Stan the Man and Roy the Boy for all those years. What was that like, and any anecdotes from that time? Between
Stan, Roy, and Sal, I had the best teachers anybody could have. Stan was so much fun to work with. If you used a clever line, he would compliment you on it. I learned so much from him. I learned the showmanship. I learned the Marvel dynamics. He was just a great teacher, and it was always fun to work with him. Roy was more serious, but Roy, I learned an awful lot from Roy, and one of the great things about Roy, which when other editors came in was kind of lost, was that once you showed Roy, you could do the job. Roy was not heavy-handed as an editor. If you were writing a book like, say, Ghost Rider or Luke Cage, you'd have to tell Roy who the villain was, make sure there was a good cover scene in the issue, and let him know if you were making any major changes like killing somebody off or something like that. And then Roy, we were all pretty much our own editors back then, because Roy would hire, once you showed Roy what you could do, Roy trusted you to keep doing it. And Sal, boy, in many ways, I wish I had stayed with Sal Brodsky's Special Projects department, because Sal could do anything. He could write, he could draw, he could letter. He knew the business end of things inside and outside. I remember once when we slightly changed the size of the comic books, just maybe like a fraction of a fraction of an inch smaller. And then when he told me how much Marvel would save over the course of a year, and it was like $500,000 just from that barely noticeable change. So yeah, I learned an awful lot from those guys. I used to hang out in the offices with guys like Mike Esposito and Frank Giacoia, who had such great stories about the 50s and 60s. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the younger writers would hang out together. Don McGregor, Steve Gerber, and myself, and others. And Gerber was one of the most generous guys around, and I learned that from him. There were times when Gerber would kind of get stuck on something, and a couple of times I helped him with something. I remember he was looking for somebody to team up with the Thing because he was writing Marvel 2-in-1, and I suggested the Guardians of the Galaxy, which had only appeared several years earlier in one comic book, and suggested that to freedom fighters in the future, somebody like Captain America might be like the very spirit of liberty. And then when I wrote Ghost Rider, Johnny Blaze into a corner where the devil was about to claim his soul, Steve was the one who said, "Why don't you have God save him?" And that ended up being a 2-year storyline because, Marvel had all these devil characters. I felt it was time for the other side to be heard from.
Oh, my God.
So, yeah, there was a generosity and a comradeship among the younger guys at Marvel. To the best we could, we kind of looked out for each other, helped each other out. I've lost track of how many professionals, when they first came to New York, stayed with me for a week or two in my apartment, and I was hardly alone in opening my apartment to people just coming into the industry. I hired, for example, Tom Orzechowski, who became one of the great letterers at Marvel. Tom Orzechowski was somebody I hired to work on the British weeklies, and when Tom first came to town, he stayed with me for a while. Anthony Tollin, who became a production manager at DC and one of their biggest colorists, and currently is like an expert in old radio and pulp magazine and publishes Doc Savage and The Shadow and other characters. He stayed with me for a while. So that was just the way it was back then. There was this bond between the comics people, and Rich Buckler would look out for the guys from Detroit, and I did too, because Cleveland and Detroit weren't that far from each other. So yeah, there was that great feeling that we were all part of something, and it would be a few years before the realities of the business would really hit home.
The realities being?
After Roy left, things got pretty chaotic at Marvel, and then, at a certain point when Jim Shooter was running things, while Shooter, of course, did some very good things for creators, before too long, his tendency to want to control everything made life hell for a lot of creators, and it's one of the reasons DC was able to pick up so many great creators during the time Shooter was running Marvel. And of course, DC was pretty much always like that. I had a staff job at DC for all of 6 months, and I hated it. I hated not every moment of it because I made some good friends, but yeah, it was a terrible experience working for DC on staff for 6 months. But again, that's old DC.
Yeah.
And I really make that distinction between old DC and new DC, who I'm working with currently, because it's like two different companies. If old DC had been anything like new DC, I probably would have stayed longer.
Why did you leave Marvel?
I left Marvel because we were, at that point, Roy had stepped down. He was replaced by Len Wein. Len stepped down. He was replaced by Marv Wolfman. Marv was in the process of stepping down, and Jerry Conway was going to come in. Jerry was editor-in-chief for all of 3 weeks. Jerry had offered me a very good package, a lot of work at a decent rate and with decent titles. Jerry didn't realize that every editor who had preceded him had walked away from the job with a contract guaranteeing them quite a bit of work and those key titles. But I did not know this at the time. At the same time, Jerry had made this very generous offer to me. DC recruited me. And thinking of how chaotic Marvel had gotten over the years since I started there, I thought, I think DC seems a little bit more stable. DC's got a new publisher that seems to really want to turn the company around. I'd get a chance to work with people who I admired, like Julie Schwartz and Murray Boltinoff and people like that. So I took the DC offer. So that's why I went over to DC, because DC at that time had made me a better offer. Now, I have to add that DC never at that time kept their agreements with me. And so that's why eventually I left DC, left New York, and did other things for years. I mean, I would do occasional things at DC. I did Hawkman. I did the second Black Lightning series. I would do, fill-in issues here and there at Marvel. But after I left New York for good, which was about 77, Marvel and DC were never my main source of income again for literally decades.
And so where does your dispute with DC over Black Lightning at the time, how does that figure in over the years with your career and ultimately the way it was, it was concluded?
Well, I don't want to go into too much, of the bad stuff. But basically, if I had to sum it up, every agreement I had with DC Comics broke. And I just, I kept thinking it would be better each time, and it just wasn't. Now, currently, under the new management, I've been treated with what I consider incredible respect. I've been given a chance to do some really interesting work. I've been, compensated well. I've worked with them on putting together collections of my old Black Lightning stories. I feel valued by DC Comics in a way I never had before. They're not perfect. There are bumps in the road. The history of the comics industry is comics creators being screwed over by publishers, editors, and sometimes their fellow creators. Treating creators with proper respect is, I knew from the minute I started working with DC again, that's always going to be a long, slow learning curve. But I'm very happy to say that during my time there, I've been able to push that line forward. Maybe not a lot, but every time somebody like me pushes that line forward, it helps everybody. And I don't think it's that the companies don't want to treat creators properly. It's new territory for them, so there's going to be screw-ups. And I've taken the position that instead of going grr, arg, and working myself into a frenzy, I will chide them, I will mock them, I will explain to them what they've done wrong and how they can make it better, and I move the line forward a little bit. I'm 66 years old, and if my legacy is always going to be Black Lightning, who I think is one of the greatest comic book characters ever created. Black Lightning will always be my legacy, but I hope my secondary legacy is that I tried to help my fellow creators, and I tried to help publishers help my fellow creators.
Well, it's certainly, we've seen, I guess in the period of time that you've been involved with comics, and certainly that I've been reading comics, which is about the same period of time, we've seen a gradual evolution of their approach in terms of, in the early mid-'70s, it was Neil Adams coming to bat for Siegel and Schuster, trying to get the creators.
Neil Adams is a hero.
Yeah, and then over the years, there was money for Bob Kane for Batman movies, and then more recently, Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson got recognition for their contributions to Batman. Chris Claremont, who I had on, like I said a couple weeks ago, we're talking about how he's benefited from the X-Men. But more recently, it seems like with the I pardon the term exploitation, but with the exploitation of comics creations in film and TV, the film and TV production companies are kind of been forcing the issue, I think, in that they want clear title. They don't want to be embarrassed when they produce a Black Lightning or something like that by having loose ends, by announcing the show and then finding out that there's a disgruntled Tony Isabella out there who created the character isn't getting anything for it. So it seems like that's been a really good thing for people like yourself, that these characters are finding new life. Is that right?
Well, yes and no.
Okay.
Hollywood is its own weird creature, and there are many instances of comics creator not being treated fairly by Hollywood, not getting recognition. I can't remember which X-Men movie it was that I saw and really liked, and then I'm looking through the end credits, and they don't mention Chris Claremont, who had created a number of the characters there. They don't mention any of the comic book creators who had created characters in that X-Men movie, and it made me really mad. That's changing. That's changing because, for example, Disney is known as a litigious company, but what people don't realize is that DC tries very hard to avoid litigation. So they have settled with the Kirby estate. They have, through Marvel, entered into agreements to ensure that creators get a piece of the action, which is really, most of the creators, they just want credit and a piece of the action. Mm-hmm. They're not looking for anything more than that. So if you have Disney/Marvel doing that, then naturally DC/Warner Brothers has to do it as well. So there's that. That's part of the reason why things are changing for the better. It's also that Hollywood comes to comics for their ideas these days. You go to Comic-Con, and you will see all these Hollywood types buzzing around Artist Alley, buzzing around the various creator booths, looking for something that they can option. Because in a world where Black Panther is such a high-grossing movie, where every Marvel movie makes a bundle of cash, where even the DC movies that might not be considered great movies still make money. Hollywood is desperate for what the comics industry has been providing for 80 years. Mm-hmm. They need us more than we need them. We're their idea factory. We're their research and development. The guys who used to get shoved in lockers in high school, I'm not going to name any names here because they've read comic books, are now the people Hollywood comes to. We now rule the entertainment world. We won.
Tony, I want to ask you a question, and I'm lifting this question. There's a podcast called Marvel Newsdesk. And they do a great job. They post every Sunday night. And I don't know if it was this week or the previous week, but they asked a really good question. I'm going to paraphrase. They were talking about the success of Black Panther and it becoming the number one grossing superhero movie of all time, basically. And I'm going to throw into that Black Lightning becoming this huge success on the CW, and then things like the Marvel series on Netflix, which I think have been far better than anyone would have expected. So the question is, what lesson do you think Hollywood takes from this? That you have Black Panther, Black Lightning, Luke Cage, you have the Wonder Woman and Jessica Jones, things like that. What, from your experience now, what lesson do you think Hollywood takes from that, and what lesson do you think that they should take from those successes?
Well, I don't want to try to get into Hollywood's head because I think that would hurt my brain. I will tell you the lesson I take from these, which is if you take these great comics creation, you treat them with respect, you understand, as unfortunately many fans and professionals don't understand, that comics are not the same as movies, are not the same as TV shows. But if you treat the source material with respect and then develop it, coupled with that respect, you get great shows like Luke Cage, you get great movies like Black Panther, you get great movies like the Wonder Woman movie. They're not exactly what you see in the comic books, but they have what I like to call the core values of those comic book characters. And that, to me, is far more important than continuity and details. It's the core values. Jefferson Pierce is a reluctant hero. He would rather not be Black Lightning, but he has these abilities, and that means he's got a responsibility to use them for his community. He is a man of faith. I've been very strong on that in the Black Lightning Cold Dead Hand series because everybody who reads our comic books should be able to see themselves in our comic books. And so gay readers should see themselves, Muslim readers, black readers, white, gay, straight, conservative, liberal, people of faith, which are generally ignored in comic books because they're usually used for villains, and not wrongly so, because there certainly are villains who operate under the cloak of religion. But those core values for Black Lightning are what I see reflected on the TV show, and that's one of the reasons I love it so much. You have just these dedicated writers and showrunners and actors bringing these characters to life, bringing these important stories to life. And, and for every alt-right Nazi out there complaining about us social justice warriors and snowflakes and such like that, we're reaching people who have not been reached before. The young gay woman who sees thunder on Black Lightning, things like that. Mm-hmm. We are inviting these people who have traditionally been treated as outsiders, and we are inviting them into our world. We are making them feel welcome in our world, and that's as important as the bottom line of these movies and TV shows and comic books. That we are pushing the bar for diversity and inclusion that much higher. We are doing our best to create the world that comic books have always wanted to see. Because comic books, especially comic book superheroes, have always been progressive and have usually been liberal. The alt-right Nazis can bitch about that all they want, but that's the case. Superman ran crooked politicians and businessmen out of town on a rail. Superman and his fellows were accepting of all kinds of people. The Justice Society brought food to starving patriots in Europe. Captain America punched Nazis in the face. We have always, our superheroes have, Captain America is an FDR Democrat. Mm-hmm. We have always been a progressive genre. And there's no turning that tide back, no matter how many bumps in the road we hit and how many people complain about that on their little YouTube videos and on Twitter. Mm-hmm. We're winning, and we're going to keep winning.
Well, Tony, as we kind of wrap up, so the latest issue of, as we're talking, the latest issue, the 6th issue in the miniseries, Cold Dead Hands for Black Lightning, I guess is due out next week. Is there anything else of yours you want people to look for coming out? Or
well, if they want to see how anally retentive I can be, they can go to Amazon and get a book called July 1963, A Pivotal Month in the Comic Book Life of Tony Isabella, Volume 1. Because looking back on my career and realizing how important that month was to me, I have embarked on a plan to buy, read, and write about every one of the 138 comic books that came out that month. It's a fun book. It'll take me 8 volumes to get through the entire month, but I think if people will go to Amazon and look for that, I think they'll enjoy it. It's comics history, it's comics fun, and it's a little real world history as well. And there'll be more comics and other things from me. I'm currently discussing with a local independent filmmaker who wants to buy an option on a movie I've created. I will likely be doing more comic books in the near future. I'm kind of having finished Black Lightning Cold Dead Hands, which I am so proud of, because I was working with great editors like Jim Chadwick and Harvey Richards. Artist Clayton Henry was amazing. Colorist Peter Pantasia just made everything look so good. It's a book I'm really proud of, and I'm sure I'm going to be doing more comic books. I just, at this point, having just finished that, I'm not 100% sure what my next project is going to be.
Okay. Well, folks, listen. You can see Tony Isabella's comic book creation, Black Lightning, come to life every Tuesday night on the CW, right after The Flash. And if you haven't, if you somehow have not started watching it, the CW app is great. You can download it and you can catch up on the episodes you've missed there. If you want to know more about what Tony is doing day to day, not just in that 1 month of 1963, you can go to Tony Isabella's bloggy thing, which he's been doing for years. It is his blog. It is tonyisabella.blogspot.com. And Tony, you are also, you can be reached on Twitter and Facebook, correct?
That is correct. I have a Twitter account. It's at the Tony Isabella. And on Facebook, I have 3 separate pages. I have my personal Tony Isabella page. There's the official Tony Isabella message board group. And there's the First Church of Godzilla page.
Well, I got to ask you, take 1 second and explain to people what the First Church of Godzilla is.
Well, as we say in the church, all hail the great scaly one who protects us with his fiery atomic love. It can be a tough love, but folly of man and all that kind of demands that. Everyone is welcome to the First Church of Godzilla. White or black, gay or straight, Christian or Jew, whatever, we all sound pretty much the same when we're fleeing in terror from Godzilla. I am a huge fan of Godzilla and cheesy monster movies. My yearly vacation, I go to Chicago for G-Fest, which is the big Godzilla convention. I review cheesy monster movies on my blog from time to time. So after comic books, my next creative love is cheesy monster movies. And the First Church of Godzilla celebrates that.
And just to be clear, how long have you had the First Church of Godzilla? Because I know it's been a long time.
You know, again, had I known anybody was going to ask me questions like that, I would have taken notes.
That's all right. It's been a while. I know it's been around for some time. We'll let it go at that. Tony Isabella, always a pleasure talking to you. So happy, as you know from my comments online the past year and beyond. I'm so happy for the success and the recognition that you've finally gotten for Black Lightning. And thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
You're welcome. It was great talking to you again.
Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience full of equally deserving veteran comic book creators who hope Marvel and DC will eventually bring creator rights mea culpas and a big old bag of cash to their doors soon enough in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Rich Scheidner. And if you've ever wondered what it was like to be a stand-up comedian in the 1980s, I'm going to do you a big favor. Instead of billions of dollars for a time machine, you can just spend $24.95 and buy my new book, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It will save you money and give you thrills. It will take you there. Go to my website, richscheidner.com, go to amazon.com, and buy this book.